The spring of 1945 was not a time of hope in the Pacific. It was a season of industrial slaughter. For 3 long years, the United States military had been cutting a bloody path across the world's largest ocean, capturing islands whose names most Americans could barely pronounce. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliui, Iwo Jima. Each step closer to the Japanese mainland became exponentially more violent than the last. But by late March, the Allied High Command looked at their maps and saw only one remaining stepping stone before the final, catastrophic invasion of Japan itself. A 60-mile-long, narrow ribbon of coral, volcanic rock, and dense sugarcane fields, Okinawa. It was the centerpiece of the Ryukyu Islands. Located a mere 350 miles from the Japanese home island of Kyushu. To the Americans, it was Operation Iceberg, the ultimate staging area where they could amass 500,000 troops, park thousands of bombers, and build the supply depots required to deliver the final blow to the Japanese Empire. To the defenders, it was the final wall. If Okinawa fell, the sacred soil of the homeland would be naked to invasion. The clash that followed would not just be a battle. It would be a descent into an absolute hell of mud, steel, and human madness. An experience so traumatizing that those who survived it would forever refer to it as the Typhoon of Steel. On the morning of April 1, 1945, the largest amphibious armada ever assembled in the Pacific War loomed off the western coast of Okinawa. More than 1,300 ships blanketed the horizon. The United States 10th Army, a massive force combining seasoned Marine divisions and battle-tested Army infantry, braced for a bloodbath. They had watched the horror of Iwo Jima just weeks earlier, where Marines were cut down the moment their boots touched the volcanic ash. As the landing craft dropped their ramps on Hagushi Beach, the men rushed ashore, weapons raised, hearts pounding, waiting for the inevitable roar of machine guns and artillery. But there was nothing. Only the gentle lapping of the waves and the crunch of sand beneath their boots. By the end of the first day, 60,000 American troops were ashore with virtually zero resistance. Men joked that it was an April Fool's Day joke, courtesy of the Japanese emperor. The northern half of the island fell within days, offering little more than sporadic skirmishes against secondary forces. It felt like a walkover, but the veteran commanders among the ranks felt a cold, not tightening in their stomachs. They knew the enemy. They knew the Japanese did not simply abandon a fortress. The eerie silence on the beaches was not a sign of surrender. It was a trap deep within the southern mountains of Okinawa. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima sat in the flickering candlelight of a subterranean bunker, listening to the distant rumble of American bulldozers. Ushijima was a master of defensive warfare, and he had no intention of wasting his nearly 100,000 men in a foolish, suicidal counterattack on the beaches where American naval gunfire could vaporize them. Instead, he had spent months turning the southern third of the island into a terrifying, interconnected subterranean labyrinth. The rugged terrain of limestone ridges, steep ravines, and ancient burial tombs was perfectly suited for his plan. His engineers had hollowed out entire mountains, carving miles of tunnels, hidden artillery bunkers, and machine gun nests that could withstand direct hits from 16-inch naval shells. Ushijima knew he could not win the battle. He knew no fleet was coming to save him, and no reinforcements would drop from the sky. His objective was purely, brutally strategic, to drag the United States into a war of attrition so agonizing, so costly in human lives, that the American public would lose the political will to demand the unconditional surrender of Japan. He was going to turn Okinawa into a graveyard when the American forces turned south. The illusions of an easy victory evaporated in a flash of cordite and high explosives. They slammed directly into the outermost layer of Ushijima's fortress, the Makonato line. Suddenly, every square inch of the landscape became a killing zone. The Japanese defense was built on a concept of interlocking reverse slope positions. American troops would fight their way up a ridge, taking heavy casualties, only to find the crest completely bare. The moment they reached the top, they were exposed to devastating pre-registered mortar and artillery fire from the next ridge behind it. While Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden tunnel networks behind the Americans to cut off their retreat, it was a three-dimensional chessboard of slaughter. The earth itself seemed to be alive and hostile. Flamethrower tanks, nicknamed Zippos, were brought forward to blast rivers of liquid fire into the cave openings, but the tunnels ran so deep that the defenders would simply retreat into the bowels of the mountain, wait for the flames to die down, and then man their machine guns the moment the peekaboo infantry advanced, as the meat grinder on land chewed through thousands of men. A different kind of terror was unfolding at sea. The Japanese military, desperate to halt the invasion fleet, unleashed its ultimate weapon on a scale never before seen: the kamikaze. On April 6, the sky darkened with hundreds of planes. These were not traditional strike fighters looking to drop bombs and return to base. These were guided missiles made of wood, canvas, and human flesh. Young Japanese pilots, many with only a few weeks of flight training, strapped themselves into planes loaded with explosives, took a final sip of ceremonial sake, and dove at terminal velocity into the American ships. The sheer psychological horror of the kamikaze attacks was paralyzing. Sailors watched through binoculars as planes flew through walls of anti-aircraft fire, shedding wings and burning furiously, yet refusing to deviate from their path until they slammed into a deck in a catastrophic explosion of aviation fuel and shrapnel. For weeks, the naval forces were subjected to relentless, sleepless nights of radar alerts and fiery impacts. Dozens of ships were sunk and hundreds were damaged. The psychological strain was so severe that Navy hospitals filled with sailors suffering from acute combat fatigue, their minds broken by the constant, inescapable threat of a diving ghost in a bid to deal a decisive blow to the American fleet. The Japanese Navy launched a final, tragic suicide mission. The super-battleship Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed warship ever built, was ordered to sail south with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan was madly heroic. The Yamato was to fight its way through the American Armada, beach itself on the shores of Okinawa, and use its massive 18-inch guns as a shore battery until it was destroyed. But the era of the battleship was already dead. On April 7th, long before the Yamato could get within sight of Okinawa, hundreds of American carrier-based dive bombers and torpedo planes intercepted the giant vessel. For hours, the ship was pounded by wave after wave of explosions. The Yamato, an engineering marvel meant to symbolize the eternal spirit of Japan, capsized and exploded in a mushroom cloud that could be seen for 100 miles. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors perished in minutes. It was the definitive end of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a clear signal that the homeland was completely on its own. On the island, the weather broke and the heavens opened. In May, the seasonal monsoons turned the battlefield into a vast, putrid sea of liquid mud. The landscape was stripped bare of all vegetation by millions of artillery shells. It resembled an apocalyptic nightmare. Tanks became hopelessly bogged down in the mire. Supplies had to be carried to the front lines by hand, through knee-deep mud mixed with maggots, decomposing bodies, and swarms of flies. The stench of death was all-consuming, soaking into the clothes, the food, and the very skin of the soldiers. Men lived in flooded foxholes alongside the rotting corpses of their comrades and enemies, unable to move for days under the threat of sniper fire. The physical misery amplified the psychological horror. Men began to crack under the pressure, experiencing what doctors called the Okinawan line fatigue state of total emotional numbness, where soldiers stared into space, indifferent to the explosions around them. It was a war stripped of all glory, reduced to a primitive struggle for survival in a swamp of human misery. The epicenter of this madness became a low, unassuming hill known as Sugar Loaf. To a casual observer, it looked like a harmless mound of dirt, but to the 6th Marine Division, it became an altar of sacrifice. Sugar Loaf was part of a complex three-hill defensive system that guarded the western anchor of the Shuri Line, Ushijima's main defensive bulwark. For over a week, the Marines launched assault after assault up the slippery, muddy slopes of Sugar Loaf, time and again. Small groups of men would claw their way to the summit, only to be blasted off by a torrent of heavy mortar and flanking machine gun fire from nearby positions called Half Moon and Horseshoe Hills. The hill changed hands more than a dozen times. Companies that went into the assault with 200 men were reduced to 20 within hours. The fighting was hand-to-hand, featuring grenades cooked until the last second and thrust into cave openings, bayonets, and entrenching tools used as weapons in the dark. When Sugar Loaf finally fell, the cost was staggering. The Marines had sustained nearly 3,000 casualties on a single hill, a grim testament to the fanatical determination of the defenders. By late May, the relentless pressure of American artillery and the slow, costly advance of the infantry finally breached the Shuri Line. General Ushijima realized his positions were becoming untenable. Rather than making a final, suicidal banzai charge, as many expected, he chose to execute a brilliant, orderly retreat further south to the Kion Peninsula. He abandoned the historic Shuri Castle, leaving behind a ruined landscape, and pulled his remaining 30,000 troops into a series of jagged coral cliffs overlooking the sea. The Americans, exhausted and battered, hoped the retreat meant the end was near. Instead, they found themselves facing a concentrated version of the same nightmare. The southern tip of Okinawa became a meat grinder of unprecedented ferocity. The Japanese soldiers, knowing there was no escape, fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. There were no lines anymore, just isolated pockets of fanatical resistance in caves that had to be systematically sealed with satchel charges or filled with burning oil. The tragedy of Okinawa was not borne by the military forces alone. The true horror of the battle was suffered by the civilian population. Caught between two massive war machines, the Okinawan people had nowhere to hide. They had been subjected to years of intense Japanese propaganda that painted the Americans as monstrous barbarians who would torture and rape anyone they captured. Terrified, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled south into the same caves and ravines used by the Japanese military. As the battle reached its climax on the southern cliffs, the scene turned apocalyptic. Japanese soldiers, desperate for food and shelter, forced civilians out of the caves into the open artillery fire. In many cases, families committed mass suicide rather than face capture, using grenades distributed by the military, drinking poison, or jumping hand in hand off the sheer cliffs into the jagged rocks and crashing waves below. Mothers drowned their infants in the dark recesses of caves to keep their crying from revealing hiding spots to American patrols. By the time the firing stopped, more than 100,000 Okinawan civilians, 1/3 of the island's entire population, lay dead by mid-June. The organized Japanese defense began to fracture into chaotic chaos. The American commander, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., stood on a forward observation post to watch the final lines break. In a cruel twist of fate, a stray Japanese artillery shell struck the coral ridge where he stood, sending a sharp shard of shrapnel into his chest. Buckner died minutes later, becoming the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the entire Pacific War. Just days later, on June 22nd, inside his deepest command cave on the southern coast, General Ushijima prepared for his own end. He wrote a final message to Tokyo, apologizing for his failure to save the island, put on his full-dress uniform, and walked out onto a small ledge overlooking the ocean. There, in accordance with the ancient samurai code, he committed ritual seppuku. His chief of staff followed him seconds later. The brains of the Japanese defense were gone, and the remaining troops were left leaderless, scattered across the cliffs, fighting until the last bullet. When the island was finally declared secure on June 22, 1945, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over Okinawa. The 82-day battle had been a tactical triumph for the Allies, breaking Japan's final inner defense line and securing the ultimate vanguard for the invasion of the home islands. But the cost of that victory was so catastrophic that it altered the course of human history. The United States had suffered over 12,000 men killed and more than 36,000 wounded, the costliest campaign they had faced in the Pacific. The Japanese military was virtually annihilated, losing over 110,000 men who chose death over surrender. When military planners in Washington looked at the butcher's bill for Okinawa, single island just 60 miles long, they shuddered to think what would happen when they launched Operation Downfall, the invasion of mainland Japan. They estimated that an invasion would cost up to 1 million American casualties and millions of Japanese lives. It was this terrifying mathematical reality, born directly in the mud and blood of Okinawa, that ultimately convinced President Harry Truman to authorize the use of a terrifying new weapon, the atomic bomb, to bring the war to a sudden, absolute end without an invasion. The Typhoon of Steel had broken Japan's final line, but the scars it left behind would reshape the world forever.